Colorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative by Glenn Loury. Read by Glenn Loury. To the memories of Gloria Cartman Roosley and Leonette Lowry Smith, who were there with me from the beginning. Preface. We're playing a game, you and I, listener and author. An aging black academic economist and conservative social critic of some prominence sits down to write his memoir. He is relatively well known, but not a household name. He is occasionally recognized by strangers on the street, but not every day. If the listener does know of him, that listener may know that he has more than once publicly reversed his positions on a number of important issues of the day. The listener may know that he has endured more than one public scandal. The listener may know that he is accorded respect in some circles and scorn in others. Perhaps the listener does not know anything about him at all. Whatever the case, the listener, being skeptical at the outset, will try to discern exactly why this aging black academic economist and conservative social critic is writing a memoir in the first place. That is, the skeptical listener will ask just what story this guy is selling, what image of himself he is trying to get across, what details does the author finesse to make himself look better than he might otherwise look. What embarrassing incidents is he passing over in silence, lest they make him look foolish? What impression is he trying to make? The listener will attempt to read between the lines, to locate the fatally flawed flesh and blood human lying beneath the narrative construct that the author has assembled for the listener's enjoyment and perhaps for the author's own self-aggrandizement. Call this game the problem of self-regard. Your role in the game is to search me out, not the narrative construct me, the real me. My role in the game is to get you to call off the search, to convince you that the narrative construct and the man are one and the same. But I can't just ask you to surrender your critical faculties and believe whatever I say. That would be a red flag, a clear indication that I'm trying to pull the wool over your eyes. So I need to find a way to convince you to believe what I tell you about myself, even though you know it's in my interest to portray myself in the best possible light, no matter how improbably rosy that light may be. My strategy is as follows. I know you are going to be on the lookout for anything that discredits my story about myself, a contradiction, a slip of the pen, an inadvertently revealing detail about my behavior. Since I know that you won't be satisfied until you find this discrediting information, I will dispense it for you freely, openly, and undisguised. My bet is that this strategy of self-discrediting disclosure will accomplish two things. First, it will appease your impulse to find cracks in the edifice of my self-presentation, to search out my contradictions and too convenient narrative contrivances. Second, I hope to exploit a paradox that these self-discrediting disclosures will initiate. The more self-discrediting information I deploy, the more credible I will become. I will convince you that I'm not lying because no sane person would invent the discrediting things I'm going to tell you about myself. As you take in more and more such discrediting information, I will accrue a kind of credibility capital that I can spend on incidents that cast me in a more conventionally positive light, because I am reasonably sure that you will then consider me to be a reliable narrator. A possible objection from you, the skeptical listener. I say that no sane person would invent this discrediting information about himself, and yet I've laid out a rationale for doing just that. If I'm most concerned that you buy into my self-presentation, and if I know that you won't be able to do that unless I disclose discrediting information, then don't I have a strategic incentive to invent discrediting information if I find myself in need of it? My rebuttal is simple, if distasteful. I am going to tell you things about myself that no one would want anybody to think was true of them. And yet they are true. I'm going to tell you that I have lied because I need you to believe me. I'm going to tell you that I have deceived those closest to me because I need you to trust me. I'm going to tell you that I have abandoned people who needed me because I need you to stick with me. I must tell it all in this memoir, because if I don't tell it all, nothing I say will be heard. The skeptical listener will have observed that this game has already begun. Chapter 1. I'm standing in my Auntie Elois's living room. It's summer, and Chicago's air is thick with humidity. My shirt is starting to stick to my back. All I want to do is tear off my jacket and tie, kick off the dress shoes torturing my feet, leap into street clothes, and run out to join whoever else in the neighborhood has managed to extract themselves from their homes. But duty calls. Auntie Elois's living room is beautiful, elegant, just like the rest of her house, like Elois herself. A baby grand piano sits in the corner. Stained glass-fronted, recessed bookcases, filled with classics, line one wall. With its 6 bedrooms, its 3-car garage, its fish pond and barbecue pit in the backyard, its flowing drapes and French provincial furniture, chaise lounges and all, the place is an extension of the woman herself, regal, tasteful, and timeless. Up the stairs leading from the kitchen is a small, semi-separate apartment where my sister, my mother, and I live. We pay some rent, but less than we were paying before Elois gathered us up and brought us here. Certainly, in the sort of places we used to live, there were no bookcases, no chaise lounges, not much of anything special, and there were a lot of those places. We moved from apartment to apartment, so many that I had attended 5 different schools by the time I reached the 5th grade. In Auntie Elois's eyes, this would not do. A Negro woman, as she would have insisted on describing herself, of her ambition and vision, wouldn't allow it. Next to me stands my younger sister, Leonette, along with 4 others. These are my cousins, a set of siblings whom my aunt took in and adopted as her own. We shared equally in Elois's beneficence. They had different fathers, but the same mother, who was troubled. Raising 4 children on her own became too much of a burden for her, so she left them to foster care, and they were sent to different homes. When Auntie Elois got wind of this, she decided to gather them up, adopting over the course of a few years first Diane and Jimmy, then Herman, and then little Larry. She was determined to unite them all under one roof. Married to Uncle Mooney, but childless, she was doubtless thinking of her own 3 siblings, my mother and their 2 brothers, Adlert and Alfred, who were sent to live with different relatives when their mother, my grandmother Nettie, passed away. Elois just could not abide seeing that family broken up. I'm ready to bolt, but I don't dare. Elois herself sits on the sofa before us. At nearly 6 feet tall, she is imposing, even when sitting down. A cigarette rests between her fingers. Smoke swirls ceilingward, and afternoon sunlight pours in through the windows behind her. She looks at us and smiles. So, how was church? What was Pastor Bob's sermon about? This is the Sunday ritual, the one we'd been preparing for all afternoon. You better be paying attention. You better not be goofing off in the back row. I'm not expected to recount how I heeded the altar call, went up in front of the congregation and dropped to my knees, humbled by the power of Jesus. I didn't do that in those years. The spirit that moved other folks to tears and spontaneous exaltation did not quite move me in that way. But that's not what this ritual is about. The point is, you better have something to say when asked a question because Auntie Elois expects an answer. I recount the Bible passage the pastor spoke on, the movements of his speech, where his voice grew excited and where it came low. I recall the shouts of hallelujah echoing from the pews. I offer up a phrase or two from the sermon verbatim, or close enough to verbatim. I'm sure Pastor Bob wouldn't consider a little embellishment to be so great a sin. She stops me in mid-sentence. So, what do you think that means, Glenn? What's the point of what the pastor said there? How does it relate to you? This is not something I've thought about at all. I've got nothing at my fingertips, no rehearsed answer. But silence is not an option, and so I improvise, spinning out an interpretation of the pastor's words that I hope will pass muster. She nods in approval, and I continue on. I think I'm pretty slick. She doesn't even notice I just pulled all of that out of my hat. Only later would I realize that far from putting one over on Auntie Elois, I was learning exactly the lesson she wanted me to learn. It had little to do with merely recounting a sermon, little to do even with veracity. Years later, when my own children would stand before me, and when I would stand before lecture halls full of students, I would understand what the Sunday ritual was really about. Look beneath the surface of things and tell us what you see. But right now, I'm just trying to get through it, hoping Woody and my other buddies haven't grown impatient and headed off on their bikes to who knows where. I know Woody wouldn't leave me behind if he could help it, but a wave of insecurity washes over me. I tell myself that I would wait for Woody if he were in my increasingly uncomfortable shoes, and in the moment, it's true. Finally, after Leonette, everybody calls her Lily, and the others have performed the ritual to Elois's satisfaction, we are dismissed. I thud up the stairs, change as quickly as I can, and race out the door. This is Elois's South Side, 7329 South Michigan Avenue, Park Manor. Black families living in well-kept homes in a neighborhood knit together through a sense of community and kinship. They owned small businesses, performed skilled labor at the steel mills or in the stockyards, and often had a little hustle going to make ends meet. In Uncle Mooney's barbershop, for example, you could get a shave and a haircut in the front room and then slip into the back to buy a little reefer or whatever fell off the back of the truck that week. It wasn't exactly legal, of course, but as far as Uncle Mooney saw it, nobody was getting hurt. He was going to take care of his family, and he wasn't relying on the law, even civil rights law, to get that done. The white man may have let black folks into the schools and restaurants, Mooney would say, but you can call me when they start integrating the money. Until that day came, he didn't see why he shouldn't earn in the back room what the white man wouldn't let him earn in the front. And besides, that extra cash helped him keep Elois living in a style befitting her stature and ambition. That ambition wasn't just for her. It was for all of us. This is the woman who took in 4 orphans, plus her sister's family. This is the woman who raised funds to ensure 2 of her nieces, Alfred's daughters, could attend Fisk University and then made sure they knew the right sorority to pledge when they got there, despite never having attended college herself. This is the president of the Social, Religious, and Literary Guild of our Bethel AME Church, a position that accorded her a certain status in the community. My Auntie Elois was extremely attuned to all the minute signs distinguishing those of one status from those of another in the black community. She acquired this sensibility from the great aunts, a generation of matriarchs that came before her, her mother's 5 older sisters who, along with 5 brothers, had migrated up to Chicago from Tennessee and Mississippi in the years after World War I. These people carried themselves with a certain class. They had made a way out of no way, acquiring modest wealth and property through sometimes dubious means. How you presented yourself in public mattered to them. The thinking was, no matter how someone made their money, they ought to know how to handle themselves, how to communicate that they knew their worth. A man might work in a stockyard, but before he went out for the evening, he knew to bathe, shave, shine his shoes, and dress in a way that reflected his aspirations for himself and for those around him. Viewed in this perspective, the astounding stylishness of the South Side of the 1950s and 60s was in no way superficial, and it was not unexpected. Style reflected ideals and ambitions that might otherwise have gone unexpressed in the often trying conditions under which we lived. There was a line, after all, a line between those moving upward and those sliding back into a sordid condition from which one might never break free. A line between nascent bourgeois respectability and hopeless poverty. A line between legitimate or mostly legitimate ascendance and backsliding. Elois stood firmly on one side of that line. So, when she saw my mother's marriage to my father fall apart, and then another marriage go the same way, when she saw her sister Gloria, their brother Alfred called her Go-Go because she was always on the move, bouncing around the west side, moving Leonette and me from apartment to increasingly shabby apartment, Elois made it her duty to yank us back to the right side of the line before we crossed too far over, to mold us who were yet without shape, who could go either way. I sit on the bed in my mother's room in our apartment attached to Elois's house. It's Saturday night, and these are the last moments I will spend with her before she goes out with her friends, out with a man, to dinner, somewhere. I can see her face in the mirror as she stands before her dresser, slowly rubbing cream into her arms, the milky white dissolving into her brown skin. She examines her face and sings softly, absent-mindedly, along with Judy Garland's The Man That Got Away. Gloria has a beautiful voice, and as it ascends through the verses with Garland's, it drifts and mingles with the scent of perfumes, oils, and powders. She considers each ingredient carefully before plucking it from the forest of bottles and jars on the dresser. A spray of this, a dab of that. Occasionally she glances back and smiles her sweet smile. She sits down on the edge of the bed and pulls on silk stockings. I have only a vague sense of where she goes and what she does on these evenings. But I know my mother is a beautiful woman, a desirable woman, and this has something to do with whatever happens when she goes out into the night. I tell her I need something. A new notebook for school, a new sweater like the other kids are wearing. Something. She stands to approach her dresser and looks back at me through the mirror. Ask your father. He should have sent me money last week anyway. I don't push it further. She knows if he hasn't given it to her, he doesn't have it. Maybe if I'm feeling bold, when my sister and I go to stay with my father next weekend, I'll ask, but I know what he'll say. You need money? Get a paper route. That's what he did when he needed money, he'll remind me. He went out and got it himself. There was no one he could ask, nor is there now, not his father, who abandoned him as a baby, not his mother, who died when he was in high school, or his grandparents, who have it hard enough. My father has no Elois to rescue him if he slips, no gaggle of cousins and aunts and uncles to fall back on. He has nothing but a rigid sense of virtue and self-respect to keep him from whatever disaster waits on the other side of the line. Born Everett Loury, Lowry, when a school teacher misspells his name Loury, he opts to keep the new spelling. His own father had left him nothing more than that name, and in surrendering it, my dad found a kind of freedom that could be maintained only through the practice of rigorous austerity and personal responsibility. This is my patrimony, what I'll receive from him in place of the money he cannot, in fact, afford to give me. My mother turns from the dresser and again sits on the edge of the bed. She's lost in thought, singing plaintively, "Don't know what happened. It's all a crazy game." My mother is a kind and generous woman, but her relationship with my father is strained, and that confuses me. There's tension there. Lily and I can feel it, even though we're only kids. They play a game, pretending to be cordial to cover over the tug of war raging underneath. So, if a stranger with some sad story asks Mama for a hand up, she's inclined to help, but if I want something that costs money, she'll say, "Ask your father." And if I wince, wondering why she would give money to some anonymous drunk but not buy her son that new notebook, that new sweater, she'll admonish me not to judge that drunk. You never know what's behind another person's troubles. There, but for the grace of God, go you or me. That's what she'd say. I don't quite understand why this seemingly boundless sympathy does not extend to my father. My mother is ready. She checks herself in the mirror, making sure every fold of her dress is perfectly in place, making sure her hair frames her face just so. Park Manor, the South Side. Well-kept lawns, respectable black folks inching their way toward prosperity, values instilled and sustained by church, the family, and common sense. All this is true. It's also a story, the kind you tell yourself in those moments when, indulging in a little nostalgia, you reminisce about the good times. But it is not the whole truth. And if it's a story, it's a cover story, one that obscures the darker undercurrents in the world that shaped my early life, where people walked on both sides of the line. It is true that Elois's house was a monument to an ideal for living. It is also true that in that house, our friend Boo Boo's father, a man suffering from mental illness and alcoholism, shot himself in the head as my horrified, helpless mother looked on. It is true that on some Saturday afternoons my mother would pack a lunch, and friends and family would meet at the park, spread out on the grass, and eat her delicious food while cheering on my Little League team. I was a pitcher and third baseman. It's also true that one of my teammates, Paul Schumpert, a nice, quiet kid who lived down the block, would die from a heroin overdose at age 18. It's true that my mother's kindness had no limit. When Cousin Ronnie, strung out and skinny, would knock on our door asking for something to eat, my mother knew he was only there to steal money from her purse. She would invite him in anyway. Pig, a grade school nemesis of mine, robbed a currency exchange, shot a cop, and caught a life sentence. My pal Stevie's friends accidentally shot him in the gut while playing with a gun. They panicked and ran, and Stevie bled out on his mother's basement floor. Even in the heart of Park Manor's most respectable venue, the church's literary society over which Elois presided, disreputability snuck in. It was rumored that my Uncle Adler had managed to seduce every member of that committee, aside from Elois herself, of course. My mother took delight in saying so. Did it happen? It is certainly possible. Tall, well-built, intelligent, and handsome, the silver-tongued Adler, a graduate of Morehouse College and Northwestern University School of Law, had no problem finding women. Neither did his brother, my Uncle Alfred, who eventually fathered 22 children by 4 different mothers. Alfred's appetites may have outstripped the confines of respectability. He was roundly denounced by some of the great aunts. But he was quite the patriarch. His sense of duty as a father, stretched thin though it may have been, gave his life meaning. He thought of himself as founding a clan. His models were the biblical prophets. He took "be fruitful and multiply" literally and seriously. He was, in his way, a quintessential family man who maintained a fierce devotion to each of his progeny. His wives, Betty, Marybelle, Rose, all had bills to pay, so Alfred hustled from one job to another in order to take care of all his children. He'd go to the great aunts with his hand out, especially Cammie, who'd taken him in after his mother died, and Rosetta, who was the eldest and most prosperous of the bunch. He'd even try to borrow money from my mother when the creditors were on his heels, and he could get it if she had it, even if it cost her son that sweater. That's just how much she loved him. My dad has run out to get something from the grocery store, so Lily and I are snooping. This is a delicate operation. My father is a creature of habit and order. If we leave anything out of place, he'll be sure to notice. That's part of the game. The risk of detection makes it all the more thrilling. His single-room efficiency apartment, with its tiny kitchenette, a sofa, and a bed that folds down from the wall, is a far cry from Elois's palace. This isn't my dad's ideal living arrangement, but the Spartan conditions suit him. There's no space wasted, and no space to waste. I open his closet. Everything hangs in order. The suits in one section, pants in another, shirts in another, all of them pressed and straight. His ties hang from a rack, all of them evenly spaced. On the floor sits a shoe tree holding probably every dress shoe he's owned since his feet stopped growing, all of them polished, spotless. I move to his dresser and find what is likely the most organized sock drawer that has ever existed, with brown socks to one side, then white, then black, then navy, all of them folded in uniform fashion, nestled like eggs in a carton. Even his underwear is neatly folded and stacked. This all strikes me as funny, or at least remarkable, but I do not know why at the time. It will later occur to me that Lily and I may have been the only other people besides his future wife, Constance, ever to see the inside of that apartment. It is not the sort of place set up for entertaining guests. My father's rigorous arrangement of his most intimate possessions is not done for show or in case someone checks.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?